Well, it's nice to be here. It's nice to see you guys. The first 3 people who walked in were my students from last year, so that was also nice. Yeah. Well, this should be fun. This is just like the house I was in, my childhood house, as is this. Only our garage was on the left side. This is the house I lived in this was my childhood house. It looks different now because there's an addition on the top right there. They expanded it and tried to personalize it. This is more what the house looked like when I lived there. This is my neighborhood. Every house was either had a garage on the right or the left. Some of them had 2 windows over the garage and some of them had 1. We used to drive home a different way to see one house that had marble staircase, and one house had painted their garage different colors, and we used to go a different way to see that one sometimes. It was the 70s, and made me sensitive to small differences, I guess, similarities. It wasn't the first suburb. This is Levittown in 1948. Another image of Levittown in 1948. This is the first truly mass-produced suburb in the United States. At this time, in July 1948, the Levitt brothers were producing about 30 houses a day. Yeah. This is another view of Levittown. There are 4 Levittowns. This is the first, New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey. Where's the 4th? Trivia question. No one? Puerto Rico. That's rough, right? Levittown, Puerto Rico. This is how you get from Levittown to my house. 6 miles. I guess 6.3. It's interesting to me the way that this sprawled. Levittown is still almost entirely white. It's 95. I think there's like 2% black population in Levittown now. My neighborhood up there was almost entirely black, and there were a lot of Jews and Puerto Ricans there. The Levitt brothers couldn't have bought a house in their own neighborhood that they were building at that time. The way that this relates to my work will become clear a little bit later. But reciprocation, which is the name of this first part of the lecture, is a pretty simple idea, but an interesting one I'm taking from Elaine Scarry. It just means that we intend something when we build it, but then reciprocally that thing shapes us. And I think that's kind of a core idea for this lectures, is how the things and places that we build shape us. So back to my old neighborhood. Another interesting thing about this is how little open space there is. On my block, you can see, let's see if I can get that over here. This looks like an open space, and we did spend time in there, but it was actually just for some kind of water collection thing. Some of us were better at climbing the barbed wire than others, but it was kind of one of the only open spaces, and then the streets were our open space. We didn't quite know what to do in the outside of the schoolyard. We just kind of beat the crap out of each other there. We didn't quite know what to do with our freedom. This is where I live now. So part of my interest in environments shaping us led me to build this house for myself and now for my family. That was an unusual day there where I had more than one helper. Usually it was just me and Sally, who was a recent Bard graduate, building the house. You can see there's a day with less snow, but here comes. Some days we spent a quarter of the day just shoveling snow off before we could get to work. The timing was backwards just because of when I was able to buy the land and when I was able to get approval for it and things like that. Some things it has in common with my old house in Westbury is that it is considered a kit house by the architect I worked with. And what that really means is just that he knows how much material goes into this house. It's a modest house, especially by American standards. It's about 40% smaller than most American houses that were being built at the time. It's entirely wood on the inside. There's no particle board, there's no plywood, there's no sheetrock in it. It's just wood. What the architect provides is 2 truckloads of wood, siding, doors. He sent me way too much siding and too little interior sheathing. But what he designed is like this basic structure that you see here. I changed it, like raising the collar ties. And then you do what you want with it. We put windows wherever we want, doors wherever we wanted. But it simplifies the building process so that I was able to build this in 8 months. It was totally monomaniacal, 8 months, but I've enjoyed that. This is the downstairs. So what it has in common with Westbury is it's small, it's efficient, it's affordable. I bought the land and built the house with $14,000. I mean, the banks were giving out money easily in 2005, but I didn't have any particular job to speak of, and I just took that out of my retirement and bought the land and built this. It gets passive solar heat from these windows in the back of the house, so I oriented it to get passive solar heat, which is a really simple process. You just have to have the windows facing due south, and then a thermal mass, which is in this case, the slab. There's no basement, but so the slab, absorbs sun all day and then gives back the heat. That's basically how this passive solar works. And then there's a wood stove downstairs also and radiant heat in the floor. One thing that this has in common with my work, and one reason why I want to start out with it, is because what interests me about the house and why it's still really valuable to me and informs my practice is not because of how it looks, but because of how it functions. So even the way that it looks has a function to it. Like, it's pretty traditional. You can see we put the windows equidistant on it. And I feel like that's part of the experience of the house, that you walk in and you immediately are oriented in the house. So people feel comfortable when they walk in the house. And I think that's part of it. It's not it might not register consciously, but people do feel comfortable in the house. It is also like it's bright and it's warm just because it's efficient, like I said before. And one of the things that is also often said is that it smells good, especially when I was building it, because there was no like plywood dust or sheetrock dust when people walked in. What they smelled was the pine. And if my saw was sharp, it wasn't a burning smell, it was just like a dusty smell. The other reason I built the house is because most of the things I could afford needed to be torn down and then built up again. It's discouraging. Have you guys seen this one? Yeah. This is about maybe 10 miles from my house. Someone earned a lot of money, I think, on the stock market, and he wanted to build his personal palace up in his old neighborhood. So this is surrounded by little kind of suburban houses, and they're a little bit upset by it. But I'm using this as the image of American housing in 2005. It's not entirely fair, but I'm not really interested in being fair. I'm just trying to make a point. So the average house in 2005 was, like I said, 42% larger than my house. It was difficult. One of the things the bank had a hard time with was finding a house being built that was as small as mine, which is big by world standards, but is 1,400 square feet, but very small by American standards. But intimacy is a really important aspect of my practice, my life, how I see the world. And this is a project I haven't done yet, but I'm thinking about just making intimate spaces. So this is just a room with a waterfall over it, a porch with rain on it. And then I was thinking about a friend of mine in Houston who bought a house that's so big he couldn't even furnish the parlor, the entry to it. So this is a sculpture for him, a sculpture for Sean. But I also thought that some of these giant houses should have intimate spaces. Like, it seemed like an emergency to me at some points that these giant houses that seem like they're built for spectacle needed a place for people to congregate and talk to each other. So I thought you could just cut a hole in your floor or smash it if you don't have a wood floor. I proposed this to Smack Melon, and they weren't really that happy about it. But if you also wanted a small space to heat and cool, you could put a pop-up tent with gray felt on it. I thought the gray felt is a little nod to Joseph Beuys. If you put mylar in it and ground the mylar to an outlet, then it might also reflect phone waves and internet, and you might have a quiet space in there also. I haven't tried that, but I got it from a very reliable conspiracy website. I think I wanted to be an architect, but there's something about my composition or something that is much more interested in things that aren't quite so pragmatic. I really like practical things, but I'm interested in the places where language fails and where other things can happen. So failures sometimes allow something else to happen. Failures are opportunities to me for other kind of forces or events to rise up. You notice that this is called, this section is called supertext. It's not subtext. I'm calling it supertext because I'm seeing all this stuff as being like above the normal text, not below it. But when you think of subtext, you might think of like sexual subtext, and that's also part of the intention here. Part of my practice, actually, maybe even time-wise, it could be the biggest part of my practice is drawing. I don't often show drawing, but I kind of use it as a way to, for this set of drawings, probably like to get in touch with my subconscious, hopefully, or let my id speak through the drawings a little bit. Sometimes I sit down and just don't quite entirely know what is going to happen. And then sometimes it's something that I do, I can find something in the outside world that relates to it. This is not my sculpture. It's the front of this museum, kind of formal museum in Missouri, where I was asked to be in a small show with a big title about sculpture. And I thought it was such a formal museum that I decided I wanted to do something really casual to intervene. This is the kind of permanent collection side, and then we were in the other side. So I made these. You recognize the fabric? Yeah, I mean, it was a little more hip about 5 years ago. But yeah, it's cotton duck. It's the Carhartt fabric, and then the triple stitching. I took also from Carhartt jeans. These would fit an enormous person, but I was thinking of like being sort of more like child size and looking at a parent's underwear. There's two of them, which was important to me at the time. And then at that time I was doing work about masculinity and blue collar work. So that also tied in with that. This is a piece you might see if you come to my studio now. A friend of mine came to the studio recently and he was really excited about it. And he's like, that's great. And he was laughing. And I said, thank you, but I don't know why you overlooked it the last 10 times you were here. I mean, my studio was messier, I admit, but it's something that just kicks around, and I'm interested in things that you can find like that. It's kind of actually really nice that he didn't see it the first 10 times, and then I think it was probably richer to kind of discover it. Anyway, I was asked to do a public project in Kansas City. Does the sound still good back there? Okay, good. I thought of that earlier piece. I made this proposal to the city council, and it made sense to me because this building here played burlesque for 60 years. But when the city council got it, they were pretty upset by it. The mayor said it could cause a traffic accident. And it made the front page of the Kansas City Star. But I got to do it. The municipal arts counselor was behind it, and she said, she's behind it, and she will pack one bag when it goes up. Because people really wanted to be angry about this project. One thing you can't tell from the images, which really looks flip, is that it's all stuff that I sewed. Can you tell what this fabric is? Yeah, fleece, right. So it's Polartec, it's all Polartec fleece because it drapes proportionally, right? Like it has big drapes. If I used a normal fabric, it would look odd from a distance. But when you come upon this, it just, at first, what just seems odd, it just seems like displaced. And it could be displaced from really far because there are ordinances in Kansas City that prohibit hanging laundry at all. But I was interested in that aspect of Kansas City. It felt really conservative to me. It felt Southern in ways that I was surprised about. There were really strong racial and class divisions in the city that were really uncomfortable for me. And I first honestly thought of doing something that would just be offensive. And that's too easy. And I'm much more interested in this line between the appropriate and the inappropriate. And this piece really straddled that very well. There was a DJ on the radio trying to get people upset about it when I was there. He was saying, I don't know how many millions of your taxpayer dollars went into this. And the interesting part was he had not seen the piece. He had seen a picture of it in the paper. And he was just trying to get people angry about it. And people were calling in saying, have you seen it? You know, like it's actually very festive. Because the experience of it is very different than a photograph of it. It really does rely on that kind of shift in scale of being in the presence of it. And coming upon it and the element of surprise. This is a recent installation of it. Humor is a really good tool for public art. I actually think it's much more important in public art than it would be in a normal kind of gallery or museum situation. It's a hook that I like to use. I'll talk about some other kind of hooks for public art. But the one thing about public art is it has to do something. It can't just look like something. I just read a few books on trauma that were inspired by somebody in the audience here, who I won't mention. But the first book was it was about trauma and Buddhism. And one thing I learned was that rule number one of Buddhism is dukkha. You guys know what that is? Mark?
It is suffering.
Suffering, yeah. Okay. Rule number one is suffering. And the book is about trauma. And one of the reasons I'm photographing this is because, you know, what that means is that we all get smashed around, right? So it can break you. It can also create character. So all the shapes here that I'm showing you are basically from being smashed around. So the artists are the New York Sanitation Department. All I did was empty them out. I didn't scrape the gooey stuff from the bottom, but other than that, I emptied them out to shoot them. And other than that, all this work is done by the New York Sanitation Department, picking them up from the trucks and then smashing them down repeatedly. These were in Washington Square Park, so probably some skaters helped it a little bit also. So this is a physical trauma, but for it to be a psychological trauma, the injury or the response to the injury would have to be repressed somehow or frozen. These are all the cans that were in Washington Square Park. They've been replaced by ones that are much more cylindrical now, unfortunately. One of the effects of trauma can be dissociation from the body. And I think it's also can be one of the effects of our mass media. And I'm interested in doing work that sort of short circuits that. So this project was intended to bring viewers very directly back into the body and to bring them into their body in a way that brought them back to being 4 years old, 4 to 5. I was trying to be really specific. It has something in common with the kind of vernacular of just making things big. But what I'm trying to do actually is psychological here. And so when I made this project, I wanted to see if it seemed big or if people felt small walking into this room. And the interesting part is that the furniture made people feel small. It did not seem odd at all. And it made me interested in pursuing that some more in this kind of slower piece. I got a chance to ask Roberta Smith about this fabric because I was worried that it was a bad idea to bring such middle-class fabric into the art world. And she basically told me that I shouldn't bring a couch into the art world to begin with. So all was already lost. But the fabric is amazing. I didn't make it, but it took me a long time to find it. It's even got a texture that's oversized. One of my disappointments in making this project was that people didn't get upset when they sat down in it. Generally, like at the table, it was very hard to not throw food. And in this project, people had like a very kind of like festive response to it. And the reason why it surprised me is because I had begun this piece from a memory that I had that was traumatic. And when the memory came back, I remembered being very small in a big space. And it felt terrifying, actually. It felt really scary to be so little in that space. And I thought I was making an objective project, and people would just go shooting back there, and then whatever came up for them was just what they had lived through. But after watching people for a while and really sitting there myself, I came to realize that I was bringing people back there, and people were acting like children in there. It was very hard to have a serious conversation. But you're going back with a sense of agency. You're going back in your adult life. And the other part you might notice about the design is that it's actually kind of cartoonish. If it's not scaled up directly. If I scale something up directly, it looks kind of spindly. So this is, it's a cartoonish, everything's kind of overbuilt. And in fact, the cushions were something that I worked with quite a bit because they needed to, you couldn't sink in and feel your adult weight, but you couldn't be on top of it because you wouldn't feel immersed in the piece. So I found like what I thought was a good balance there. But the feeling in these projects is often like one of, it's therapeutic. So the childhood combined with that sense of agency can be therapeutic. This is a project I drew out and began after the living room set, but the living room set took me so long to figure out how to upholster it and make the thing come apart that I put it away several times, and I made this project in between. I finished this one and showed it first. Like I was saying, it was in a few different public spaces. One of them was City Hall Park, which when you sit in it, you would be surrounded by people. And you could worry about feeling like a fool in there, but the feeling of it being kind of therapeutic and secure and overbuilt actually kind of trumps that for a lot of people, and they just kind of hang out there. It's not true of businessmen. I have to admit, we asked these guys to sit there for this photograph, and this is usually the way that the businessmen dealt with it. They checked out the hardware, and they sometimes would kick it like a used car, and they'd sit down for a second and then kind of like laugh nervously and then get up again really quickly. So, I mean, to me, that's amazing. Like, that's a sign of it being successful on the physical level, and then in that comforting way, but then also challenging on a mental level. Mayor Bloomberg opened up City Hall Park, and this was one of the first projects showed there. It's down on the Manhattan side of the Brooklyn Bridge, but he was very careful to kind of stay clear of it, like no photos there. This is the kind of dominant position you could take there. So again, what I'm working with is more than visual, it's the physical response to the piece. And one thing I'd forgotten from childhood is that picnic tables are the very last thing you can sit in comfortably because of the set distance of the benches from the tabletop. So I actually had to revise it. All right, whatever. I'll let the computer choose this next slide. Transitions are also really important in working with the body. When I was at an artist residency, I decided I wanted to make a transition from the outside artist residency into my studio space. And I was thinking about Andrew Carnegie's office. Have some of you seen that at Cooper Hewitt? It's right behind the gift shop in the Cooper Hewitt if you want to check it out. He was a small man, like Bloomberg, and he made everyone duck when they came into his office. So you duck, and you know, like almost you'd be forced into like a deferential gesture, and then you'd come up and he'd be sitting there behind this monstrous mahogany desk, right, ready to greet you. I decided to do something sort of similar in my studio, so I made these doors, and they slam that really well. The sound of slamming was to me the sound of that summer program, like the sound of these screen doors slamming. You can see the one behind her is slammed so much that it's like duct taped together, and then it's got this portable strap in there. Was all kind of the music of this project. It was also combined with the piece that you saw when you walked in there. The studio was so tall, I decided I wanted to work up there. What I was trying to do with this project physically that I think you would get if you climbed up there is I'm trying to find the point where power and vertigo meet. So there's a sense of power of being over everybody, but there's also a feeling of vertigo up there, like of it being easy to sort of tip off there, which is not a usual sensation you have in a chair, but like not putting arms on there and putting it up just high enough that it seemed a little bit dangerous was part of the project. I made a second one so that it could be a social situation, and then also so that they were used at Cabinet Magazine for a couple of years. That's Simon Critchley on the left. It's Halloween, and he's dressed as a priest. And Aaron Levy's on the right. He was talking about Catholicism. It was performative. This is another instance of it being used. That's Ariel Schrag, or Schrag, I guess. She's reading from one of her graphic novels. Her graphic novels also were often about growing up and difficulties growing up and her sort of traumas, which ties it into this section. But I hope you've gotten the point that everything in this section is about bringing a viewer back into their body. So the primary concern here is physical, even though I'm in the position of showing you these things just visually. These are some film stills, video stills from a project I did with Julianne in a collaborative project we did in Arizona. I used the Arizona sun. These were all shot outdoors to highlight people's hands and to make their bodies disappear. The title of this project is Miracle Report. And what we did was we asked volunteers, to talk about miracles they experienced. The reason this is in a section on trauma was that something I didn't know or expect was that what most people ended up talking about were traumas that almost happened, that were averted narrowly, but that they were thankful for. That was often the one definition of miracle. There was also, it was in Arizona and Phoenix, so there was also like a lot of Christian conversation going on in there, and other religious conversations. This is Patty. We ended up interviewing 75 people, and we used all of them in the installation. We had a month to do this installation, and what I decided that I would like to do in this, it was I think a 3,000 square foot gallery. Instead of trying to fill it, I decided to make it seem as cavernous as possible. So we took all the lights out, and the only lights emanating from the only lights in the space were from the hands, basically, moving. This is actually lighter than the space was, this image. And then the sound was played out loud. There were headphones used. one of our goals was to use every piece of audio equipment and every piece of video equipment that the museum owned. So it was 38 monitors, speakers, headsets, projectors in this space. And so, I didn't mean to do that. It was pretty cacophonous. That wasn't supposed to happen. So every 20 minutes, for 1 minute, the organ would come blaring and just drown out everything else. And the other times, he was playing the song on the organ, but it was just clicking the keys, like I had it when it was first playing. What's somatism? No one? It's the same thing as materialism, but I'm interested in the word specifically for this lecture. Because the somatic that I'm using a lot just refers to the body. And if I have to call myself some type of artist, I might try to call myself a somatic artist. So I'm concerned more with the body than the mind, more with the body than the usual channels of making art. But soma, in this case, somatism just means materialism. It's just another word for materialism, which is also something I'm interested in this culture. It's also soma in Brave New World. Do you guys, what was that, Liz? Do you remember what it was?
Oh, it was the drug they gave people to keep them placid.
Yeah, right? Did you all hear that? She's halfway in the middle. So yeah, soma was the drug that everyone got to be kept complacent and in line. It was like a vacation. They would get a vacation. They would just, if they started to get unhappy, the state could give them some soma and they would fall back in line. And I don't think that's any mistake that it was connected with materialism, though there was an Incan drug that was called that. In this case, I'm using the word soma because I'm wondering about how our materialism affects us, right? Like we create these things. We have all these countries all over the world producing garbage for us. We don't seem to care how long these things last or what they're made out of or the consequences for the places we're buying them from. But we just want our things and we want them cheap. And I wondered, sometimes it seemed to me a little pathological, I have to say. I also wondered if that soma, or if that materialism is what sort of keeps us accepting things politically that we might not otherwise. Anyway, all this brings us back to Levittown again, no surprise. This is what went into a Levittown house. This is also around 1948. See the picket fence? I like that detail. This is probably a staircase. Like I said, they were building 30 of these in a day, so they would ship these things out and construct them really quickly. I actually think that the construction materials and the construction of those houses are better than a lot of the houses that are being built now. I think that was kind of a point of decline in American architecture. It seems even like that houses have been built to last shorter and shorter amounts of time. If up around us there are these stone houses that'll be around for 300 years, and the houses from the early 1900s, maybe 200 years, and then the 1930s, maybe 100 years. It all seems like it's coming to some sort of deadline, in my opinion. So like the 70s, maybe 30, 40 years, and the houses that are being built now are just garbage, 5, 10 years. Particle board. This is called one circular because all this text is just from one circular. I am not anti-materialist. That's why the metaphor I can only carry so far. I'm not against it. I don't want to call it a drug, but I do think we just need better material things in our lives. I'm purely a materialist in that sense. And I did this project where I was just trying to slow down the consumption a little bit. And I would take packaging I really liked and just make a small gesture. I wasn't trying to stop it completely. I was trying to make something completely precious, but just slow the consumption down a little bit. So I still have these objects, but it's interesting how dated they are already. So I just cut a piece of walnut to fit the packaging that I found interesting. This is just a piece of wormy walnut and a piece of green marble, some odd green marble I found. But even that packaging looks dated now, right? This was a proposal for a project for Socrates, which is built on a landfill. I just proposed that they took the trash from the landfill and put it in the walls and dug a hole, and then it could be in the walls for display. And then it could be an emergency nook. Everyone could meet in there. And then any water would be evaporated from this cupid back here. It didn't happen, but it led to another project, which I'll show you in a little bit. One of the things I'm doing is working with materials as though they're really precious, like overlooked, sort of discarded materials. So when I'm digging around my house, I find broken rocks sometimes, and sometimes I make prosthetics for them. So I found that top half, and then I made the bottom half. Here's another one. So I'm just taking a piece of scrap walnut in this case, and this tragically broken rock, and then just making a piece to fit. More prosthetics. This one I found both halves, but it just seemed like it needed something. That's two views of the same one. I have lots more ideas for rocks. I'm not going to show you any other drawings, though. The rocks that I'm choosing relate to the tradition of scholars' rocks, which goes back 1,500 years in China. The Chinese developed way back then 4 criteria for rocks. And then also one of the reasons for selecting a scholar's rock would be if it looked like something. It could look like a cave or a mountain or an animal or any of these 4 criteria. The rocks that I choose have none of those criteria. So they're decidedly anti-scholarly rocks. And it's interesting how hard it is to find a rock that doesn't actually resemble anything. Because when you look at something long enough, you start seeing something in it. Here's another project just making something precious that's not. Do you recognize what that is? Yeah? No? What? No, it's one of those crummy plastic balls from the supermarket. It was just outside too long. You can see the seam in it. I'm not entirely sure why it's off the ground here. I didn't take this picture, but the glass is held in by the inflation of the ball. I didn't actually put the glass in. It's just inset in a dado in there, and the pressure of the ball is holding it out. So maybe I overinflated it a little bit, and the ball is also holding the whole vitrine off the ground. I'm not sure. Other sort of discarded materials that are kicking around. This is cabinet-grade plywood that was kicking around my studio. And what I'm doing is digging through there until I find something worthwhile in there. So like this is just a shim that was in there. And then the stripes are from cutting through the layers of plywood. There's nothing added to this at all. I'm just basically digging through the plywood. The pink is the glue that was holding the plywood together. I'm just cutting between layers to make these pieces. Another thing I'm treating in a precious way is this a combination of 3 building materials. I love that this pink foam, which is kind of ubiquitous, comes in either like baby pink or baby blue. I'm not sure what the marketing research was for that, but I guess that gives you a sense of comfort, makes you want to buy this stuff for your house. But when you add 2 inches of pink foam and 3/4 inch plywood to this, it makes a perfect golden section in proportion. So the box is all golden sections. Immediatism is a term, I think, that Hakim Bey coined, right? Which is really about trying to do things in an as unmediated way as possible. I thought the simplest way to make a table would be just to smash the top off it, a rock, And you could use stumps for chairs. I haven't done that yet, but it led to the project I'm about to show you. You could also just pile up rocks for a chair. Here's a more sophisticated chair. And there's one that could be indoors or outdoors. I also thought that if cinder blocks were just a little bigger, they could be furniture. So I made some. This one on the left was outside a show I had at a museum in upstate. And after the show was over, it fit so perfectly in this lobby that they wanted to keep it. Only they said, it's outside the museum in the hallway, so we can't insure it. And I said, it weighs 500 pounds. I'm not too worried, and it's concrete. I'm not so worried about anyone running off with it. Some of the other work I've been doing is much more vulnerable, and one of the reasons I wanted to make this is because it's pretty much impervious to anything. This is a chair on the right, which still needs a little work because it doesn't look like it's comfortable. It doesn't need to be really comfortable, but it's just a little bit too uncomfortable at this point.
You'll never get it comfortable. So.
Yeah, I can get it more comfortable. This is another project I'm trying to make comfortable. This material you recognize? Plywood, just the cheapest building grade plywood. This project, I'm calling it the 99% project for a couple reasons. One is because I want to honor and connect with Occupy. And the other is because one of the rules for the project is that I use the kind of the lowest grade plywood, and I have to use 99% of the sheet for each piece. So this is how you make a table from a 99% of the sheet. So like this is the support for the table, the top, and this is the base. This is the joint that supports it. Get it? Mm-hmm. Good. This is what's left over. This is the 1%. It's interesting how little 1% is. I do not count the dust because if I counted the dust, I could only make 4 vertical saw cuts in these pieces, and that's 1% of the sheet. But that's one thing that was kind of eye-opening to me in thinking about like the whole 99%, 1% thing is really how little that is. 4 chairs come from one sheet. If you look at them, they all have slightly different geometry. That was to make them more comfortable. I was working on it. These are all prototypes, and I was making them more comfortable. This is how you make 4 chairs from one sheet. This is what's left over from that sheet. And this is really just a mistake of the prototype, sort of, because I changed the angle, so I was rich. I had this last piece left over. Otherwise, there would just be dust. I'm making all furniture for comfort and for being social. For this, and for being. I haven't made a bed yet, and I'm not sure if it's part of the project, but I made this couch, which is actually very comfortable. I got the geometry of it right. Yes? There's a couple of people who've sat in it. Oh, come on. All right. I'm not asking them. It's very comfortable, despite what people in the front row might say. And this is how it's made from one sheet. The leftover here, this is the 1%. This triangle and this triangle is the 1%. This is a support. These are the arms. Oops. The computer is making me go fast. This is the 1% from the bench. So there's the triangles. If there's a couch, there should be a table. I call this the non-Gucci table. The way that I was able to use the curves is that all the little pieces here get sandwiched between the big pieces. So there's 2 outside pieces, and in between here is all scrap, is all the little pieces. So that's what's left from that sheet of plywood. If any of these pieces are not successful, I can always make them into paintings. If there's a painting, then there needs to be a bench in my world. So the painting is one sheet and the bench is one sheet. There's a detail of the bench. And that's what's left over from the bench. This is one of the earlier pieces, and I'm not sure if I'm going to keep it, but I can always make it into a painting. And that's what's left over from it.
The proportion of your house, actually?
It's close, but it's not exactly right. I have to work with the dimensions of the plywood so that I use the whole thing. This is again like, because I wasn't calculating the saw kerf right, I ended up with a little bit more scrap than I wanted. So that brings us to Utopia. I like that segue. This is Utopia, as I see it. It's always temporary, right? I was going to put a small U on Utopia, but I believe it does exist. It just exists in temporary autonomous zones. These are all gone now, all these bungalows. But I have been spending time down in the bungalow colonies in Sullivan County because in my mind, at least, these are all kind of utopic communities. There was an August New York Times article that was about the bungalow colonies saying how cheap they are and how all these people from Brooklyn were going up there and buying $12,000 houses. But there were 783 bungalow colonies, and very few of those are actually being recuperated. So it's pretty easy for me to find the ones that are in this kind of condition. They're much more common. But to me, this was a place, at least in my imagination, where Jews from the city went to escape the heat. They spent the whole summer there. And the activities there were very physical for the most part. They played board games, but then they would entertain themselves with things like, these are handball courts. Here's some handball walls up there. But I idealized that. I probably wouldn't have liked it if I was there, but I just like the idea of people going up there and spending the summers together and making their own entertainment. There were some that had more entertainment, like there was the Borscht Belt entertainment there in the bigger colonies, but the ones that I photograph are these smaller ones. The challenge of photographing them is just trespassing in Sullivan County. The pools are of particular interest to me, which might be a personal thing. It also ties in with what I was saying earlier about when things fall apart. See, there's a tree growing in the back of that one. And there's a bigger tree in the front of this one. When things fall apart, there's opportunities for other things to happen that I really find interesting. But also, pools for me are important. Whenever I have a emotional time in my life, a tumultuous time, I often dream of swimming. And if I'm doing well, I can swim underwater, I can hold my breath. I've had really transparent dreams that even the psychiatrists in the audience wouldn't have a hard time with, like where I rescue little boys and I'm swimming underwater and and I'm breathing the water. But I don't fly, unfortunately, but that's as close as I get. They're also important because I love cold water. I like to jump in the water upstate. It always brings me back into my body. This is a piece that was made from the exact opposite of cold. I drew this when I had a fever, and I remember the moment I surrendered to the fever. I was just like, I quit fighting it, and I just relaxed, and it felt just great. I was just sweating, and my body felt so heavy that I thought this was an attempt to be an image of that moment of just like feeling this weight. Like it felt like gravity increased all around, and I was just hot, and it was just, the sweat was just flowing out. When I draw, though, I'm looking for things like that, like things that relate to actual experiences, but I'm trying to draw in a way that's not limited to that. When I look at the drawings, I'm looking for something that is uncanny, familiar and not familiar, but something that crosses into the real world in a way that I find productive, or a way that combines certain odd experiences in a way that feels not like fantasy, but like just sort of peculiar or displaced or odd or uncanny. Definitely fantasy comes up in the drawings, though. And then once in a while, when I have an opportunity, some of these things do get constructed. And then sometimes when I have an opportunity, I think of one of these and then I can modify it. So that drawing I showed you earlier of Socrates Sculpture Park, the hole in the ground with the trash in it, did not get made for a number of reasons. One was that it would be way too wet there, and the other was that the trash in Socrates is mostly landfill, so I wouldn't have found any really good treasures there. But they were interested in it, and they asked me to make another proposal. And I thought, in that park, it's so rough, I thought of this piece, that it would be amazing to do something that was exactly the opposite of that kind of sterile, to make something totally clean and sterile in that environment. But I wanted it to do a number of things. I couldn't leave a glass roof on it. I'm going to show you a few variations, because this is how I think. Like I can think of something, but it's not enough for me to write it down. I need to see it. I wanted to keep people off the top. And I wanted to integrate, I wanted this to be a vitrine, first of all, which was easy, but I also wanted it to be a bed. So this drawing, the only difference here, which was a revelation to me, was just to make the headboard and footboard built into it. I also wanted it to be a condominium, and I also wanted it to be a crypt. The condominium was partly an allusion to the neighborhood. It was one of the fastest growing neighborhoods in the country at the time, that part of Queens. Now, one of the interesting things about working with furniture in public space is that everyone has a really sophisticated understanding of it without studying it necessarily. It's a little bit like it's not muscle memory, but it's another kind of intuitive intelligence that I can work with in public space. So raising the sides here just made it tip too much into being a crypt. Didn't mean to do that. Just that gesture. But if I'm painting or something like that, I move something around a little bit. It's not quite so meaningful. But this, I'm trying to get all four of these things together, right? Crypt, condominium, bed, vitrine, in equal parts. And the equal parts is important to me because that's kind of the way of dream, like that. The condensation of dreams is that it's all at once. It's not like one thing at a time. Like if it was a condominium at one moment or one place you looked, and a crypt at another place you looked, it fails. But so it has to be simultaneous, so, right? Like in a dream, if you're at school and then you're in your underwear, that's cool. But if you're at school and you're in your underwear at the same time, that's when it starts getting interesting. It's the simultaneity of it, or it's your girlfriend and it's your mother. Like it's the simultaneity that makes these things interesting. So that's what I was balancing out here. And this is the final drawing before I made the project. I used it to solicit help for the project. This is the piece. And this is an example of an image you probably should not use in a slide lecture because it's distracting, right? Like, what's going on here? and this, like the guy in the background. But it works for this piece. I got linens from Proprioception. You're looking at $5,800 worth of linens. Don't ask me why, because I quit asking questions, because everything I asked pretty much just showed how little I knew about expensive linens. They came to Socrates and they put them on the bed. They said, Proprioception needs to look a certain way. And they came out. It was muddy that day, and she was in very expensive shoes, and I was worried. She brought her big iron, and she walked through the mud. It was her first time in Queens. She showed up in a limousine to put sheets on my bed. But this is cool. I did not pay anything for this. Proprioception's threatened because they don't want Frette to have sheets on my bed, right? Proprioception needs to stay on top. Frette also wanted to put sheets on my bed. So did ABC Carpet. You can do this. You can get materials for your projects. You can have these companies work for you. I also got 1-800-mattress to donate the mattress, but that's not as interesting. This is the spot. You can see like little vents here. I asked a friend of mine who was an engineer how to keep condensation out. At the time, Sarah Z had a project in the corner of Central Park that had all this condensation in the window, and I did not want that to happen here because it would ruin the sheets for one thing. And I thought he'd say like, throw a bag of rice underneath it. Like that made sense to me. But he said, you need 50 vents, a fan that comes on for half an hour every 4 hours at a certain CFM, and you need to put a vent in the ceiling, and then it should work. So I did that. And it worked. The piece is now in Boston in front of the DeCordova Museum. Every once in a while, teeny tiny little black critters can get in through the vents. I've taken care of that for the most part. But other than that, it's stayed pristine all these years. The sheets do get sunburnt after a couple of years. So I did have to call Pertese and ask for more sheets. And they said, they're just going to get sunburned again. And I said, and yes, and during that time, 60,000 people will see your sheets. And they said, we will think about it. They gave me more sheets. But they took them. They took the yellowed ones. I don't know what they did with the yellowed sheets. It was my chance to sleep on it, you know. Because to be honest, once she had folded this bed, I was sort of terrified of touching it. It was like so perfect. Anyway, that's it. I ended on the image from my lecture, and thank you all for your attention. Any questions? I have only admiration for that work. I also admire like the way R. Crumb makes lines. I also would love to steal from Dürer or his prints, or Da Vinci, but I can't. The way I draw is kind of by default. I don't know, I just have done it so much. I'm showing you like a tiny portion of the drawings that I make. I make a lot of drawings. And so it's just, it's what works. It's sort of, for me, cartoonish. It does touch on the surreal, but I don't want to end up there. What I want to do is make things that are surreal but return back to reality. The surrealists were really trying to get to, they were trying to make things that did not make sense to normal consciousness. And I want to make sense to implicit consciousness, to like the kind of, to say like muscle memory, the title of this lecture, or proprioceptive knowledge. Like when I'm using a chair, the way you move is part of the knowledge I want to connect with. It's not surreal at all. It's actually the most basic and mundane material that there is, that I can think of. In fact, it's sort of below consciousness. The title of the lecture, Tacit Dimensions, in fact, comes from that. I took it from Michael Polanyi, who wrote a book called The Tacit Dimension, singular. And what he was talking about, the premise of the book is that we can know more than we can describe. And he says, you could pick your mother out from hundreds of thousands of people if they were around, but you couldn't describe her well enough for me to find her. And that's the premise of the book. And he's a scientist who is going sort of the way of phenomenologists, trying to understand the basis of science, or the understructure, or what supports science. But he did it in a way that he was really honoring it as a kind of knowledge. I take that a little farther and I bring it into all other kinds of knowledge, the knowledge of the body, intuition, which is something that Polanyi talks about, but doesn't talk about so directly. And then also other kinds of knowledge, like the warmth of my house, or how you orient yourself in a space. All that stuff is really what I'm trying to get across to you guys in this lecture. It's a great question. To make truly public work, you have to reach a much broader audience. And when I work in public space, the way I see it is that the work has to do something. It can't just look like something. You can't expect to slow somebody down to look at it. If you're expecting to slow them down, say making like a Calder or something like that, I think they're beautiful, amazing pieces, but they only work for a tiny fraction of a public audience. I think to reach a bigger audience, you need the work to do something. So to do something means one of the things that I do is I take something familiar, like furniture or clothing, or a site, like the way I use the door, and then I change it so it's peculiar. And that changing, it sort of short circuits the whole resistance to art that a lot of people have. Like the problem with the Calder isn't that it's abstract. Often it's that a lot of people might feel like they don't have an understanding of abstract art, and they automatically can't quite get there. So it sort of short circuits all that. What people are confronted with is an odd situation, like why is this thing so big? Or why is there, or some of the pieces are really a simple displacement, right? Like the bed that's out in the woods, or the underwear in Kansas City. It will be striking even if it seems to be normal because it's in downtown Kansas City. Oh, and it did cause a traffic accident. The mayor was right about that. I think also sometimes humor happens because I'm also short-circuiting your usual kind of discursive process of your mind, like I'm surprising you. And sometimes humor happens when something just comes in the moment before it reaches that normal, like, cognitive process. And humor is almost a way of discharging that, like, oh, it's like it's a moment of surprise. That's also humor. Another element that works for me for public art is making something functional. So that, like those pieces I showed you at Cabinet or with Ariel Schrag on it, when people use that, because it's functional, they're getting engaged in it, and then their body and their response to it is open to the work in a different way than they might be if I, say, drew a picture of it, or I made even a very amazing painting of it. It's effective. And I would say that it's not just my art that's effective, it's not just public art. I would say all art is effective. It's just effective for different audiences at different times, right? So like you guys coming to school here, a lot more art will be more effective for you more of the time. But when your parents come to your show next week, you might not find the same thing, right? It might not be effective. They might be like, why am I supporting you in this venture, right? That's one reason I'm not coming to your opening next week, actually. I hate meeting your parents. A lot of my work is public, so I've showed the photographs. Well, actually, the collection of photographs of Washington Square Park, I showed in a sculpture show. It was the only photograph in a sculpture show. The rest of them, I've showed in a museum photographs, but I also had drawings in there and small sculptures, which is really kind of unusual for me. So almost never. Yeah, they're more, and on my website they're called observations. Yeah, I don't quite know how to use photographs as things yet. And because, like, one of the principles for my work is that it's practical, like it needs to do something. There are plenty of photographers who make amazing things that do something, but it's not what I do. It's not what I do well, I would say. There are plenty of artists who make drawings that are really amazing. Agnes Martin can make some horizontal lines on a piece of graph paper, and the way that thing interacts with light is just like a trip. It's amazing. But I can't do that. And I'm not patient enough for that, and I'm maybe more, I want to reach a broader audience than that. But I also totally respect that work. But it also means that I rarely show drawings, almost never. People love to talk about themselves. But I have to say that part of the project was not me. That was my wife, who is also much better socially than I am with things like that. It was the idea for even asking people was her idea to begin with. The ideas for, like, how the hands would be and the space, the material parts of it were mine. She and I have very similar interests, but we go divergent ways. And she has a way of connecting with people that is really phenomenal. And those were all just done from an open call. And people just do like to talk about themselves. Yeah. No, I don't really believe in irony in general or sarcasm. I just feel like it's not that interesting. I think there was a certain point in our culture when it was really important that we needed irony to undermine, like, a kind of monolithic view we had of the world. But we don't have a monolithic view of the world right now. If anything, irony is like the most common form of expression. And sarcasm is adolescent, in my opinion, a lot of the time in artwork. I think if you're going to be sarcastic, you have to be really angry. And then that's something else. And the same thing with irony. If you're going to be ironic, there's got to be some fuel behind it. And then it might be transmuted into something else. I hope that painting is not ironic. The way I described it seem dismissive of painting, but I love painting. I'm not Rothko or Agnes Martin, unfortunately. So one of the things that I really like about paintings can be just like their size and their weight on the wall, just the way they occupy space. And I admire people who can make painting. I just am tied to this kind of practical reason that kind of prohibits me from doing that. The closest I can get is drawing. I think we kind of just dig off layers as time goes on. Like, there's nothing I'm doing now that I didn't want to do a long time ago. It just maybe wasn't. There's a lot of trial and error in there. I'm making a lot of drawings I'm not showing you. One of the great things about drawings is that I can make mistakes and they're not so costly. I can imagine something giant and make it happen immediately. And then if it's no good, it just goes in the box with the other ones, or I throw it out. But I always had a kind of practical mindset. When I was my first basic studio class was with Ronnie Horn. Do any of you guys know? You must know her work, right? Do any of you know her personally? She's intense. She blew my mind. She was 29 years old, and she was teaching at Colgate University, where she shouldn't have been and I shouldn't have been either. It was farther from New York than she realized. She was by far the smartest person I had ever met, and unforgiving, and her work and her practice is really incredible to me. But I had to find something practical in it. Like, I had to find like its relationship to architecture and to the world. Even when I'm looking at Carl Andre, I'm thinking about them as bricks, And so I always had that tendency. But if the lecture seems coherent, that's because I've worked on this for a really long time for you guys. I did not sleep last night because I was thinking, like, what am I doing? I felt like I'm raising all these questions that not only are difficult to answer, but they're difficult to even articulate. I mean, what's it mean when I'm talking about tacit dimensions, right? They're like silent dimensions. I'm talking about intuition as being an educated process, as something that's very cultural. It's usually, intuition is the thing that sounds natural, but I'm talking about it as a very educated process. I'm talking about proprioception in artwork, which is not so common. And I just thought, proprioception has to do with learnings from your body, like how your body moves in space. Is that a good definition? Good enough? Deferring to the psychiatrist in the audience, who wrote the book, by the way, but who won't be named. But proprioception is like you learn something in space. So like what I'm working with in that large furniture is just your proprioceptive attitude to furniture. You're used to sitting in a certain way. Almost every chair you have ever sat in your life is between 17.5 and 18.5 inches tall. It's very specific. Stairs that you go up are whatever the rise and run of them is, rise and run, they almost always add up to around 23 inches. So if it's taller, the run is shorter. If they're shorter, the run is longer. Otherwise you trip. That's all really interesting territory for me. I don't really want to trip people. It's not that interesting, but maybe that can come into, it's stuff that I'm aware of. Other sort of proprioceptive things or bodily things would be just the warmth in my house, how it holds the heat, or the way that you occupy social space. So like when you're in the subway, you're very comfortable touching strangers. Yes, all of you. It's a little creepy, right? Especially probably for the women here, like to be that close. In a normal situation, you have another kind of social space you occupy. When I lived in Texas, the Mexicans had social spaces about like this, and Texan social spaces about that. So when you see a conversation between a Mexican and a Texan, it looks something like this. I love that stuff. Like that's, for me, practical stuff for making art from. I don't know how to do it yet. It hasn't come into the work, but it's stuff I'm paying attention to. So it's the long answer to a short question, but it's the process of paying attention, and learning and theorizing. I mean, I've also just done a lot of reading on this, but for me, the theorizing and reading and research can be anything. I just read 3 books on trauma, and that was initiated by The Trauma of Everyday Life, which the author in this brought up that I've mentioned so many times, because trauma was what sort of initiated this lecture for me. But I couldn't have one topic that overrode the whole thing, so then I dedicated it to 1 chapter of 6. But so for me, studying trauma is research for my work. Studying yoga for many years is research for my work. The only reward from studying yoga for all these years is that I can keep my knee from going like that at the doctor's office when she hits it. And I'm a cartoon figure, and if you get 108 yoga poses for dummies, that cartoon figure is me. It was traced from that. But that is not that important to me. It's not on my resume, but it was important to my work. And like, part of what I'm trying to relate to is stuff that I've learned just through my body and from paying attention in yoga class. I rob and steal from everywhere that I can, basically.